Good evening. Thank you all for coming. You're very welcome. My name is Phil McCarthy. I'm the Chief Executive of Caritas Social Action Network, and it's my job just to open the evening and to welcome you all here. And just to say, if people do come in, or if anyone would like to, maybe you could move forward, because there's a bit of lacuna at the front here. So do feel free to move forward into the body of the kirk, as they say, north of the border. So you're very welcome, whether you're here from a diocese, whether you're here from one of our member charities or from a religious order, or from a funder, a trustee, or one of our speakers. You're all very welcome tonight. And I particularly wanted to thank Cardinal Vincent for making the time to be here today and to speak to us later. There's just a few practical matters. We will be filming tonight, and so if you have a particular objection to that or to being in the photos, please do let a member of staff know, and we'll try and meet your requirements. The loos are back down the way you came. You go back past the desk, turn right, and the loos are there on the right. There are no fire alarms planned for tonight, so if there is, the fire alarm goes off, then it's a real one, and we have to come straight out of here, and you'll see the doors straight outside, and we go straight through them. The speakers' details are all on the back of your agenda, so that will save us some time tonight, since we won't have to go through those, so you've got all those details. So the theme of tonight is care in an ageing society, and it's a really important one, isn't it? Because we are all getting older. My grandmother lived to the great age of 97, and when she got to her 90th birthday, I said to her, Nana, what's the best thing about living into your 90s? And she said to me, very little peer pressure. It wasn't an original joke, but I thought it was fantastic that she could still remember it. So today's an important day for us, an important day, I think, for the theme. So what we're looking for today is to disseminate the outputs of the Embrace project, which has been going on for the last 3 years, but also to focus on the realities and the opportunities that an ageing population and an ageing church give to us. To raise awareness that through cooperation between Catholic charities we can achieve so more, and that cooperation is urgently needed. To launch and encourage engagement with the resources that you'll be able to pick up and take away at the end of the evening. And for us as CSAN, as the agency of the church, to gather messages from you and to gather your wisdom so that we can encourage Catholics and more wider in society to take the ownership and understanding so that they can create and sustain the care that we all want towards the end of our lives and in our later years. In our wider work on this subject over the last few months, we have identified 40 messages for 10 different audiences, and we hope that we'll have many fruitful conversations in the area next year. We are aware, of course, that we're here because there's a general election on, and presumably there will be a new government and a new need to engage with public policy with whatever form that government takes. And that's something that we'll be looking to do in partnership with other denominations and with other providers in the field. So it just remains for me to hand over to Debbie, who's going to chair the rest of the evening. She is a very distinguished journalist in print, radio and television media for many years, but of particular importance and relevance tonight is that in 2009, I think she was appointed the first chaplain to older people within the Church of England, and then she's been the pioneer of Anna Chaplaincy, which is an Anglican and Methodist collaboration, which supports older people, whether they are in care homes or in the community. So we're very pleased and honoured to have you with us tonight, and I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be chairing this evening's event. I was originally invited as a guest and then was asked to chair it. And so it's a great delight for me to meet the co-authors of this new report that we're going to be talking about, Care in Time, and also to discover more about the resources that are going to be shared as a result of all this hard work. The stats speak for themselves, really. It's quite a sobering thought when you read in this report that in 30 years' time, or a little under 30 years' time, in fact, if I live that long, I shall be in my 90s, there'll be 3 times as many of us over the age of 90 than there are now. So it's a pretty pressing issue, all of this. And so I think it's very important that we give our best attention to this subject. And yes, thank you very much for mentioning Anna chaplaincy. It's been great in this last 10 years to have really seen the momentum gather. And in fact, just this last week, we've reached the stage where there are 100 Anna chaplains, or those in equivalent roles, who are working among those of strong faith, little faith, or no faith at all. But let's focus on this report this evening, and I'd like to invite our three speakers here with me this evening, Peter Kevin, Catherine Hodges and Monica Butler, to each set out their stall, if you like. And I'm going to start with Peter. You and I have corresponded a little bit over the last year or so, but Peter is the Professor of Values in Health and Social Care at Staffordshire University. And let's hear first from you.
Thank you, Dave. That's great. And I want to start by giving you an image which has been bandied around in the press and actually in policy circles for a while, and that is the image of the Gray Tsunami. And the Gray Tsunami presents an image of a flood of frail elderly people about to overwhelm us and destroy our society and wipe out all its landmarks. I think that says something about how an ageing society is being presented to us culturally at the moment. A society in which older people are often viewed as parasitic, as selfish and as greedy and as needy, in need in particular of our care, whether we like it or not. And the reason, of course, for the public fear and concern is because, as Debbie points out, the number of older people and the estimated resources that we need to care for them are rapidly expanding at the same time as our supply of younger people is shrinking. So the proportion of working age and sort of activity which is having to go into elderly care is likely to increase. Now, in the midst of this gloomy portrayal, it's easy to forget the triumph that it represents for the whole human struggle against disease and death and suffering. This is a story of success. Human life and expectations of human life have expanded exponentially. We have opportunities to celebrate our life and to struggle with the challenges of life that would have been unimaginable a century ago. So these challenges that we face are wonderful ones to have. The question is how to rise to them, how to cherish each other well, to live faithfully with each other and sacrificially where required. To recognise that in the midst of a great frailty can be found great riches, to expand our hearts as individuals and as a church and as a nation to recognise the challenge and the gift that's set before us. As Pope Francis has put it, I keep coming back to this, lifespans have increased, but society has not expanded into life. So what do we do with that? Well, the situation is going to require some firm and decisive action. And I can say without, I think, making a party political point that this is not forthcoming from our political leaders at present, and there's no sign of it. Elderly care policy is the nettle that nobody wants to grasp. There's been a green paper promised for around 2 years, which has been deferred on successive occasions, and there's no sign of it appearing yet. It's a poison chalice. You may remember Theresa May's proposals for social care for the elderly, which are in her last manifesto, rapidly labelled the dementia tax, and some people think that it sunk her prospects of gaining a working majority. Boris Johnson, just a few weeks ago, promised that he was going to get social care sorted when he was elected, but I think probably Conservative Central Office leapt on that with like a ton of bricks and made sure it never got into the manifesto, because it's toxic for leaders, and it would require a great deal of courage to grasp that one. But similarly, within the church, there's something of a crisis in elderly care emerging. Care for the elderly has always been considered one of the most basic of pastoral tasks, closely linked to the commands of Jesus. But the traditional model of supporting supporting older people first through their families, and preferably large families, then as the family became less able to cope with them, then through lay societies like the SVP, and eventually perhaps in a residential home run by a religious community, is becoming less and less typical and less sustainable. Much of the residential provision is now run by small charities. Lay societies have shrunk in number, and the average age of the congregation certainly of Catholics born in this country, has, as far as I can see, been growing as well. So there's a need for some deep thinking and courageous leadership within the church about how to identify our vision of what being elderly is in a Catholic tradition and what that might have to say to us as Catholics and to society as a whole. So that was something of what I was briefed to do. And my contribution to this report has been to try and mine recent Catholic thinking and seeing what's out there already. What resources do we have to draw on? And I'll just pick out a few strands as briefly as possible. The first is a strand that's come through all of the last three popes, which is a concern for the way in which functionalism, a concern for efficiency, has swept aside some concerns about human dignity. Human lives, real human lives, are messy. They're inefficient. They don't fit very well, as Pope John Paul II pointed out in Evangelium Vitae, into a capitalist economy or an industrialised society. They don't, as Pope Francis has pointed out, fit well with a throwaway society. And above all, they don't fit with our concern for things that are tidy, containable, and ready to go. The second strand is that the assertion of human dignity in turn rests upon two insights in Catholic theology. The first is that human life is not a bell curve that begins with birth, goes through the 7 ages of man, and ends with a tidy decline into death. Human life, according to a Catholic understanding, is more an upward trajectory in which we are born in order to be redeemed and to strive for sanctification and the vision of God. There's nothing about old age which suggests that you can get out of that. We don't retire as Christians. It is one step along the way. So the question we should be asking is not, how can we make somebody comfortable and quiet and keep them entertained until they have the good grace to die on us and stop being a burden on our society? The question should be something more like, how can we help this person to continue to rise to the challenges that God presents them to so that they can grow and continue their journey into the heart of God's grace? It raises the question of what we think care should be. And as Pope Francis says at this stage in life, we even have to somewhat, he's speaking as an older person himself, we even have to somewhat invent it ourselves, because our societies are not ready spiritually and morally to appreciate the true value of this stage in life. So how do we do that? And the second strand that I've been leaning on is kind of the obvious one of the Eucharistic body of Christ, which is only fully realised in a community of individuals who acknowledge their neediness and frailty. There is no distinction between carers and cared for, competent and carees, people who are burdens and people who fill that burden. It doesn't work like that. Each of us has a contribution to make to the common good, so that the whole community is diminished by the exclusion and marginalisation of any one of us. All of us are frail. We all stand in need of each other's help. There's no easy distinction between us. So I want to close with one more quote from Pope Francis, who said, "The Lord tells us that our history is still open. It is open until the end. It is open with a mission." And he indicates our mission with these three imperatives: rise, look, hope. And I put it to you, to us, that our charge now as a church is to rekindle a vision of what elderly care can be, beyond the merely palliative, beyond just coping, for something better than that in turn presages a vision of the kingdom of God. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Peter, very much. What an important challenge you've issued to us all there. And now let me invite Catherine to speak for just 5 minutes or so. Thank you.
Hi. CSAN have previously commissioned 3 research projects on the services provided to older people by the Catholic community in England and Wales. And recommendations have included how the church should respond to home closures and impact of social policy and related market, fewer vocations and the increasing numbers of those needing help and support. And this project explored how Catholics in different roles think about care, how they want to experience it, and what they want it to look like. Those receiving care noticed when carers paid attention to detail, when they didn't. This detail would range from knowing that someone would struggle to unfold a towel to the way they were anxious about being handled when they were washed, or the way that a cleaner paid close attention to dusting a resident's personal effects. Whilst often on the surface this can seem like small practical actions, the relational aspect of the interaction matters. Getting to know someone, understand what is important to them, and paying attention to this when you meet them. Both recipients and providers of care emphasize the importance of sustained relationships and caring, and the environment that enables carers to take time and be present with residents. In social care more broadly, the relationships that caregivers and care receivers make are the primary means of intervention, rather than transactional approach that's developed over the years. Caring is not a one-way street where something is being done to another. For many residents, the opportunity to continue practicing their faith as they had done throughout their life was an essential part of their identity, and sisters talked about how faith underpinned the care they provided to others. Religious sisters talked about the power of being present with a person at the end of their life as something they felt was an important, if not essential, part of their work. This delicate act of being present, providing support for residents and their family, clearly comes from extensive experience, which is in part embedded in their faith. Observing the care others received had an impact on individuals' understanding of how they might be treated if their circumstances changed. The most powerful experience of observing care was seeing how other residents were cared for at the end of their lives. Georgina, one of the residents, said that from observing others, she knew how she would be treated and talked about the level of devotion she witnessed. Whereas working-age adults talked about their concerns that the process of dying may involve being dependent on the care of others whilst in much pain, something to be avoided. It was striking that when asked about how they understood care to be, all focus groups moved directly to a conversation about the cost of care. Care as a business and what they saw as value of money in terms of the care they had witnessed. There seemed limited awareness about how little local authorities paid for residential or nursing care, the actual cost of care, or the difficulty of providing care at this level. Whereas those providing care set out the stark realities of funding, the implications for care, and some of the current commissioning practices where homes are left bidding against each other to provide individuals with care. It is a significant challenge to find staff that care and will stay with organisations longer than 6 months. This was frequently attributed to low wages available, with staff moving once they gained experience to other providers who offered better rates of pay. It is crucial that organisations care for their carers, many of whom have complex challenges in their own lives. Supporting staff development and empowering care staff to challenge and take action was seen as essential in affecting how care can be delivered and received. Whilst those involved in caring for others often talked about how enjoyable and how rewarding it could be, the experience for those who cared for a relative was often tough, frightening, and horrible. Care is and can be a form of stressful and emotional labour. Those who cared for relatives were deeply affected by this experience and were clear they did not want their children to go through it, planning future care to avoid this. Whereas there was an assumption by those who had not cared for a relative that they would stay in their own homes and/or their children would care for them. Across the groups, there was an expectation of choice and autonomy in decision-making about care, that homes would be adapted and care arranged to support their lifestyle. Some commented that government had failed to address the issue and thought the church should be challenging policy. Others discussed how the church family should go beyond its walls and support older adults and carers in its parish. However, many felt paralysed. They wanted to do something, but didn't know where to start. The powerful act of presence at the end of life needs to be retained. Supporting paid carers to provide relational care requires enabling environments and effective support. there is much to be learned and shared amongst providers. And action is needed locally and nationally to value and support unpaid carers. I am sure I'm not repeating anything here that hasn't been said before about the need to support unpaid carers. There is a need for parishes to extend networks of care to older adults and the carers in their community. It is likely that this will need national support. The Catholic community should bring its experience of care to influence the wider policy debate.
Catherine, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, I wonder how much of that has resonated with our next guest, our next speaker, Sister Monica Butler of the Religious Sisters of Mercy. You train care staff. I'm assuming that you also welcome this report as high time, care in time.
I will probably take a rather different focus because what I want to offer is a very simple and practical way of picking up, unknown to me, what both of our two speakers have already offered. Because in common with most religious congregations of men and women in Europe, we're living with declining numbers, and we find ourselves as sisters reflecting on the values and charisms of our way of life and asking how we can enable the most significant of these gifts to continue to underpin the mission and purpose of our service of those in need. It is our fourth vow. And in our case, we have engaged with those people who are now taking up the work we used to do in our mercy schools and care homes up and down the country, in order to underline and clarify the very values and ethos which were the reasons for the original foundation of these care homes. First, may I ask you a question? How does the ethos or the inner meaning of a human endeavor happen? How is it conveyed to those who are present? For me, it's a similar question regarding the gospel. How do people really begin to hear or receive the good news at a personal level? It's a serious question. Give it a moment's thought. How does one person or one group enable the integration of the value or ethos in the gospel or in care? How is it transferred or picked up or understood?
I think that might have to be a rhetorical question for the time being, if you don't mind.
Okay, you're
Simply
keeping
because
an
we
eye
need
on
to
that.
move things along, but it's a very important question. I do take your point.
I could offer you a couple of possibilities. Ethos, an understanding of ethos, can be described as the spirit of a community or people or system. Perhaps it indicates an inner disposition, which is then manifest in action. Sadly, we see plenty of examples of the opposite in residential care. So we have sought, as sisters, to gather as many of our co-workers as possible for a day or two of shared reflection. And this has included office and care staff, gardeners, cooks, head teachers, if it's the schools, managers, all working together to discover their own inner meaning, as well as exploring our lovely mercy charism. We know that ethos, or motivation within a group, can be strengthened or eroded where understanding and commitment is commonly held. During these days we introduce the group to the founding purpose of the place they're working in, something of its history, and then ask for their own history in this endeavor. How did you get into this situation? How they became involved. This often raises helpful information and also some surprises. And often I have had trouble holding back the connections and amusement they experience as they talk to each other about their motives. We then invite participants to consider the role they have in the home and to reflect on the reasons and values they recognize in themselves. These are simply displayed on a sheet, and it becomes very clear that most of these qualities are coming from deep within the person and are in fact commonly held. We then show a short film of Catherine Macaulay, our foundress, and this surfaces considerable engagement in the participants as they reflect on the values or ethos which clearly motivated her life. When these are gathered on a separate sheet of paper, the penny begins to drop as the similarities in her life and their own motivation for being involved become evident. And it's at this point in the day that the inner movement seems to be happening. Participants begin to claim at a more conscious level their own values and the gifts they're bringing to their work. Their goodness and their love and the care and desire to serve vulnerable people have been there inside all the time, but never spoken of, never shared among their fellow workers. And it seems to me, in my privileged position, that this is what I might call the affective energy, some would say grace, which seems to release or express the ethos or characteristics of that place in which they now work. Sometimes there have been tears in their eyes as they have talked about what they now see that they are part of, in both the founding event of the congregation and the continuing mercy gift to the world in this place. Yes, they were moved by Catherine's life and her beautiful gift of mercy and compassion, but they had never consciously considered that they too were also responding in their way to similar needs and with the same sense of compassion and care for others. It was when they were led to compare their own values with their understanding of the ethos of mercy that Catherine lived from, that they were able to assent to and begin to integrate more consciously the purpose and spirit of the place in which they were now working. We spend a little experiential time, often in the garden, developing trust in each other and noticing how trust actually develops between people. This was another value that they felt made a huge difference to the way they could support each other at work. By this stage of the day, participants were more relaxed and very attentive to the shifts and feelings within themselves. I feel this is the essence of the gospel. Something which is heard, which rings bells deep inside us at the level of the heart. When Jesus spoke, some of those who were listening heard his words in their heart, and they were changed. Most of our care staff do not say that they have any kind of personal faith, many from other cultures. They're serving people with no faith and others with faith within our homes. But they were remarkably sensitive to the love they recognized within themselves and each other, and which they were able to claim and express for those in their care. And as this awareness began to surface more confidently among them, I noticed how the loving service of others seems to invite our people deeper into their own goodness, and therefore to be an even greater force for good in their workplace. They often say to each other towards the end of this day that their awareness and appreciation of their underlying value system would actually affect them more profoundly when they went home as well. And then as we move towards the end of the day together, I offer a saying of Jesus. Be compassionate, merciful, as your heavenly Father is compassionate. I sometimes prefer to use another translation of that lovely word arising from the Greek, which is telos, means be complete, as your Heavenly Father is complete. In other words, each of us is invited to become the beautiful, complete person that we are made to be. And for those who recognize God as their origin in the group, the invitation is to be as God. The last and perhaps the most amazing outcome of working in this way with our staffs is that most groups have shifted from talking about I do this, that, and the other in this home to this is what we do in this place. They've said how much they now feel, they feel how connected to the past work of the sisters and how responsible and proud they are to be carrying on this lovely work of mercy and compassion for the sick and vulnerable people in their care. Thank you.
Sister Monica, thank you very much for a very beautiful description of the ways in which you train people who don't necessarily share your own faith, and thank you for that. Well, let me now invite Cardinal Vincent Nichols, the Archbishop of Westminster, up to the lectern, and we look forward very much to hearing your words.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for being here. Not quite a parliamentary reception that we first promised, but that's not surprising. They're all busy elsewhere. And I would like to express my great appreciation to the work of CSAN this evening and these two documents that it's launching, the Care in Time, and as we'll come to a little later, Reaching Out. Now, I'd like to begin these few remarks by just telling you of the remarks made by a priest in a pulpit one Sunday. He said to his congregation, I have some bad news for you. And he said, the roof is leaking and it has to be repaired and it's going to be very expensive. And he said, but the good news is we have the money to do it. But the bad news is it's still in your pockets. Now, in a way, I think that's a little pattern through which we're already moving and around which we can think about the challenge of the care of the elderly in our day. We've heard from a number of different directions, yes, we have a problem. We have a population that is aging. It's been described even with that fearful word of a tsunami. But even that approach sets the framework in a very negative and a very depressive mode. I remember some years ago talking with somebody who'd been asked to look into the mobility problems of the over 80s. And she said to me, actually, it's very difficult because they're out all the time. So we have to be able to take a view of an aging population, perhaps more from the point of view of that population itself. Now, I suppose I'm part of it now, and a few people in this room are probably part of the aging population. But we have lived in these last decades in a society that has rejoiced in increasing mobility, in increasing self-determination, and an increasing sense of autonomy and independence. And when the capacity for those things begins to fall away, then what I think many elderly people find is that the fragmentation of a more corporate sense of society leaves them extremely isolated. And I would say it's that problem of isolation, which is the one that comes home to me most of all when we think about the changing age demography of the country in which we live. A second item, as we have become a more technological society, a more material-based society, then the standards by which we should be offering each other care have, in that material sense, risen and make the actual offering and the provision of care in its structures, not necessarily in its heart and spirit, more and more difficult to sustain. And we've already heard that this is a topic of which little is being said in this election campaign. We have the Institute of Fiscal Studies saying that more or less every political party's manifesto is unrealistic in the vague solutions that they offer about care for the elderly. We hear talk of cross-party solutions in the days in which such things would seem utterly impossible to achieve. We have fantastic resources as the second part of the good priest's comment. If I can reminisce for a moment, when I was a youngster, probably around the age of 9, 10, 11, my mother used to go most mornings, few doors up the road, just to look in on Mr. Shannon. He lived alone, his son had gone, his wife had died, and he was plodding on. And my mum would go up every day. One day she came back and she said to me, "Come with me." So I walked up the road and we went into Mr. Shannon's house. And it's a picture I never ever forget, because during the night, Mr. Shannon had died. And he was sitting in his armchair, and my mum said, come on, come and have a look and see. He died very peacefully, and see, he was reading this book, and it was The Imitation of Christ. And that was my introduction to death and my introduction to the care of people in their last days. And then we have another kind of resource, the letter that's at the beginning of the research document, a letter from a carer, someone who has passion, great passion, for the demands and understanding for the demands of looking after elderly members of their own family, one after another. And her voice I heard echoed in the screenshots where we read that looking after your own is something completely different. And the value of support given to unpaid carers is something that is extremely important. 2 individual stories, but our resources include many, many, many caring initiatives. I remember a few years ago being a little involved in a movement which was to care for the spiritual lives of the elderly. It was French in its origin, and it had this lovely title, La vie montant, as you said, life on a continuing upward movement. The organizers wanted to find an English title for this movement, and the first one that came up was Autumn Leaves, which they thought would not do because they're mostly gathered together and then burned. So we had a problem trying to find a good alternative to La vie montante. But another experience for me from just a few years ago, in a number of North London parishes, where they developed a pattern of parish care reaching out to the elderly people in the neighborhood, not necessarily the parishioners, the elderly people in the neighborhood. And it had some very, very key characteristics. First of all, The volunteers were the key people. They had to be utterly reliable and dependable. One group of volunteers would go and bring the isolated elderly people to the meetings. Had to be the same person who went every time. And the meetings would always be in the home of a volunteer. Never in a church hall, never in an institution, but always in a family home. With the children, if there were little children there, simple refreshments and a time to talk. I heard one unforgettable phrase of feedback from those who were part of that initiative. This elderly lady said to me, "This is recreating the networks of friendships that I'd lost entirely in my life." And then, of course, we have fantastic resources in the institutions that we have. And I must pay such tribute to the sisters who have developed these resources over the years. And, you know, this is deeply rooted history. There are institutions around here in this diocese, in Southwark Diocese, where sisters have been working in this mission for well over 100 years. And they are still there. And as we heard, beautifully trying to pass on an ethos. It's the care homes, the hospices that are so important and which we rightly need to consider how we find support for them and continuation in difficult circumstances. A good friend of mine, her mother died just a few days ago in a hospice. She'd been in a care home. It was wonderful for them. Yes, it was deeply spiritual. Yes, it was very effective. But it was, in that sense, utterly holistic care, which is so, so important. There's so much to be done. I hope this evening helps us to see some of those way forward. It also gives me a chance to thank so many unsung heroes, to thank so many religious institutions, especially religious sisters, to thank so many volunteers, so many trustees who give of their time to support and help grow so many different organizations, who all wish to respond out of love to those most in need. And of course, a word of thanks to Phil and to CSAN. A last word. Speaking to, 1.5 million young people in Krakow, the Pope said to all these young people, if you want to be signs of hope, if you want to be agents of hope in the world today, then go home and listen to your grandparents. And in that sense, he told us that the elderly among us are a treasure to be nurtured and from whom we will learn so much. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody. I hope the evening goes very well.
Cardinal Vincent Nichols, thank you very much indeed for all your words. It has to be said, though, that this is the fourth report in 20-odd years on this subject, and things are going to have to change, and I hope that we will have a chance to tease out some of the issues of the ways in which we're going to have to think rather differently in the future. We've got a different landscape that we're all moving into inexorably, and it is very important that the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, all the different denominations speak with a greater voice of unity on this. And I'm glad you mentioned the carer who really did speak in very clear terms that she wants to hear the Catholic Church thundering, yelling what its position is around the vision for the ways in which social care and spiritual care, distinctive relational care, is going to pan out in the future.